This is my wife's 2012 Subaru Outback. Today, this area here is going to get repaired. I don't know if you noticed, but there is a scratch. It's somewhere, right in this area, right here. Welcome everyone, I'm Kirk and this is the Art of Auto Painting. I decided to start this channel to help others who want to get into the field of auto painting or just your DIYers at home who want to tackle some of these smaller repairs themselves. I figured with 30 plus years in the paint industry, in the auto painting industry, that it was time to pay forward a lot of this knowledge and skills I've acquired along the way and help you all out. So today what we're going to do is we're going to do a small repair on my wife's car, a corner bumper scratch. And I'm going to teach you guys every step that you're going to need to do and perform to get good quality results. I'm going to teach you exactly the way to do it, what materials to use, and the paint system you're going to apply once it's fully prepped and ready for paint. So I hope you stick around and let's go through this process together and I'll teach you what I know. So today will be my first time as well using a rattle can to perform a repair. I'm a professional, I use professional equipment and professional paints. But today we're gonna do this together. I'm just as curious as you are to see how this turns out. So let's get started and let's give her a shot. This can all be done with things you can buy online, a few simple hand tools, and you can get a good result. All of the products and materials I'm going to be using here, you can get online. Most of which on Amazon, some of which you'd have to get on an actual paint website, like this one here. This is Automotive Touch-Up Group. You give them your color code in your vehicle and they'll send you out the proper formula. On the left side, these are the must-have, the bare minimum you're going to need to get the job done as far as materials and tools. On the right-hand side, these are some tools and materials. They're going to make the job a little easier for you, make the job perhaps go a little bit quicker, but it's not imperative to have these tools or materials. You don't have to have these to get the job done. You can get away with just the basics that are on this side. So a quick rundown of what we have here. This is a rubbing compound. We're going to use this to clean up the area where we actually blend in the clear coat. Here we have a wax and grease remover for cleaning the panel, a high build rattle can primer, some guide coat, blue shop towels for wiping the panel down, some masking paper, some water in a spray bottle for doing some wet sanding, some masking tape, a gray Scotch-Brite, wet sandpaper, a spot putty for filling in any small chips or scratches, a hand sanding block, and most importantly, a respirator. You gotta protect your lungs. You gotta make sure you're not breathing any of these paints or fumes in. They're highly toxic, and I suggest you get a good respirator. Okay, so on this side, we have some gloves. You notice the gloves are actually kind of in the middle. They're not must-haves, but for me, they are. You always want to protect your hands from any kind of solvents or paints getting on your skin, any kind of exposure. It's just better to be safe. We got a heat gun, a cordless heat gun I use for curing the primer in between coats of primer, a hand masker, which applies the tape directly to the paper, which speeds up that process. A blower, we use this to blow off the panel when there's dust or water to get it off there before we paint. For me, kind of a must-have, but for you at home, not absolutely necessary. This is a trim removal tool. I actually use this to get the tape to really wrap around the edges of like headlights and the edges of the panel that meets up with the bumper. These are some DeVilbiss hand wipes, or prep wipes, sorry. These are used to wipe down the panel right before you paint. They do two things. They're going to clean the panel, but they're also going to get rid of some of the static charge on the paint, which is very important when you're laying down your base coat. Here we have two orbital sanders. This one's pneumatic, which means it's air driven. This one's a cordless. These here are going to help you sand out or feather out those scratches way quicker than doing it by hand. Again, this is an imperative that you have this. Super helpful and it's going to speed up the job. But you can get it done with a hand pad or a hand block. It's going to take a lot longer, but you'll get it done. So if you already have one of these, great. If you don't, you may want to invest in one. They're not that expensive, especially the pneumatic ones. But if you just don't want to, you want to keep it as cheap as possible, you can go with a hand block. Unlike your traditional body shop, I won't be removing any of the adjacent panels or removing the bumper from the vehicle. I will, however, be masking everything off super tight so as to ensure there's no overspray on any other areas other than where I want the paint to be. We're going to try to keep this process as simple as possible while at the same time ensuring a great result. So the first thing you always want to do before beginning a paint repair is clean off the panel, whether you're using soap and water. If it's relatively clean already, you can just spray down some water, wipe it down, make sure you get all the dust or any kind of bugs or whatever might be on the surface. Just keep it as clean as possible in the beginning of the process and throughout. That is going to be the key to a successful, beautiful paint job. Next step in the process is getting some kind of wax and grease remover, something that's going to get off any kind of waxes that have been applied throughout the year, grease, tire dressing flung from your tires, whatever might be on the panel. It has to be absolutely sterile before you begin this process. In the beginning, again, and throughout the process, we keep cleaning that panel to make sure we don't introduce any contaminants that could become problematic. So we're going to sand out these scratches here. We're going to be out to an area like this once we feather it out. Then we have to prime it, and the primer is going to take us out to about here. So then when it comes time to paint, we have to cover all this primer in the color, the base coat, and then blend in the color. So we're going to need to blend that color probably all the way out to here. Then we're going to blend the clear somewhere around here, past where the blend was for the base coat. You always want to go past where you blended the base coat till you're actually back to the factory paint. And then we'll blend in the clear coat with some blender somewhere around here. So with this scratch here, it's clearly more than just a superficial, surface scratch. It's actually gone down into the paint all the way to the plastic beneath, the plastic bumper substrate beneath. So we're going to sand this all the way down to that plastic to make sure we got all the scratch out, feather it, get it prepared for primer. So today we're going to be using two different sandpaper grits for feathering out these scratches. We're going to use the 180 to get the bulk of it out. Then we'll finish it off with the 320. The 320 is going to make sure there isn't any deep scratches left that the primer can't fill. Now, for those of you that don't have a finishing sander or a DA sander, you can actually use a block, a hand pad or a block or a hand pad with 180 on it as well. And we're going to go ahead and sand this down with the 180 until we get that scratch out, or as much of it as we can possibly get out. So you can see most of the superficial scratches came out, but you still have these deeper ones where they really went through there. So we're going to keep sanding until we get all of that out. Whatever might be left behind that's deep in the plastic, we may have to use a small finishing putty. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. Let's continue. So as you can see, block sanding it by hand will, get the job done. We are sanding most of that scratch out. There is still some left in the plastic that if you were using this method, you may have to fill with a small solvent-based putty and then block that out until that scratch is gone. But we're going to go ahead and move on to my finishing sander. That's what I use every day. It makes it fairly quick, and it has the ability to sand out a lot of these scratches that are actually deep into the plastic. Today I'm going to use my cordless DeWalt sander, and let's go ahead and get this thing sanded out. So as you can see, a lot of this has sanded out. We do, however, have a deeper scratch that's into the plastic itself. So we're going to have to continue sand this down a little bit more with my 180. And whatever I can't sand out, we're going to go ahead and fill that up with some kind of putty, then block that out, and then we'll go get around to our primer. But first I want to talk a little bit about this edge here. This is what we call the feather edge, where you're pulling the layers back, trying to level them out so you have a nice smooth transition from the plastic to the paint. If you leave a smaller transition edge, feather edge like this, there's a chance that's going to show up as a wave in the final paint job. So what we're going to do is we're going to sand this more and gradually pull these layers back so as to lessen the severity of the transition. So it appears that I got most of those scratches out by using the 180. When they're not that deep, you can sand scratches out of the plastic. If they are super deep, you can't do that. You just take off too much material and thin out the material too much. You would have to apply some sort of filler, spot putty, a glaze coat. But I think we're going to get away with just sanding on this one, prepping the surrounding area, masking it off, and getting to the priming stage. So whenever I'm using my finishing sander, feathering out some kind of repair area or whatever I'm doing there, I like to blow it off with my blower to check to see where I'm at, to see if that scratch is gone, to see how my feather edge is coming along, because a lot of times all that dust gets on there and you can't even tell what you're doing anymore. Now, if you don't have a blower or a compressor at home, you can just wipe it down with a slightly damp cloth or something, or you can use canned air even and spray it off with that. But just keep it clean and make sure you can see what you're doing underneath the dust. Keep in mind, if you do use a damp cloth or anything like that, make sure before you proceed to the next step that there is no moisture whatsoever that it might have wicked into the plastic area below. Make sure it looks dry and it is dry before you proceed to actually applying primer. Now, when I say damp cloth, I mean something like a brand new paper towel. These are these blue shop towels I use all the time. I use these rolls like nobody's business. But make sure whatever you're using is sterile. Don't use an old, grease cloth out of your garage, some old sock you found in your hamper. Use a brand new paper towel, Scott's blue towel, something sterile to wipe it off to make sure, again, you're not introducing any contaminants into the field. So now we're going to move on to the next step. We're going to prep the whole area for primer and for paint. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sand down all the shiny areas here with some 1000 grit wet sandpaper. Go all the way around, all the way out to where I'm going to apply the last coat of clear. Then after that's completed, I'm going to use a gray scuff pad. A scuff pad is kind of like a scouring pad for your dishes, specifically meant for auto paint. So I'm going to use this Scotch-Brite to scuff down all the areas. I mean, all the way edge to edge, especially on all these inside corners of the very edge of the panel. You have to make sure there is no shiny spots left anywhere when you're done. Everything has to be abraded. Everything has to be sanded or scuffed in order to assure the paint's going to have something to bite into and to ultimately stick and have longevity. Don't just rush through this part of the process, sanding real quick. Oh, it looks good. It's fine. And only to look up close and you can see shiny edges all around the perimeter. Those shiny edges will be exactly where the paint fails, exactly where it starts to peel off of the edge, and ultimately your whole paint job will be compromised. Take the time, invest the time, make sure you get every little millimeter around every edge perfectly scuffed where everything looks dull. There's no shiny areas. If it's shiny, it's not sticking. Now this part here isn't absolutely necessary, but I like to keep my jobs clean as possible. I like to keep the areas that I'm not going to be painting clean when I'm wet sanding. So when I'm done, I don't have to go back and clean out all the sanding residue and sludge from around all the edges and inside all the crevices and stuff. So I take a little bit of masking paper and I'm just going to mask off that area and make sure it's not going to be getting down into all those little cracks and stuff where the fog light and whatnot might be. It's just going to save you time in the long run. I make it a habit. So as you can see, there's still a bunch of shiny areas here, 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 all about the perimeter here. Now some people might think, oh yeah, I've scuffed up the panel with some 1000, looks like it's ready to go, and just proceed with the next step. But that would be a big mistake. Like I said, if you leave any shiny areas behind, you're going to be in some trouble when it comes to how long your paint job's actually going to last. So now I think I've sanded it enough. I'm going to go ahead and start scuffing it with the gray Scotch-Brite pad. Make sure you get the Scotch-Brite pad nice and wet. You're not going to dry sand with this one or dry scuff. You want it to be wet, just like you did with the 1000 grit sandpaper, wet sandpaper. Make sure you apply moderate pressure. You really want this thing to scratch it up or to abrade the areas like I had mentioned, to give that paint some good bite. Then I take the very edge of this and I put it right into that gap there, right into where the body panels meet, making sure it's thoroughly scuffed. And I'll do that around all the edges of the panel. So right now it's a good opportunity to point out what I was speaking of earlier about getting water on your raw plastic and it kind of wicking the water into it. You can actually see the darker areas where the water is still in that plastic. Make sure it all looks dull. Make sure you don't see any remainder of water in that, or you're going to have some serious problems down the road. All right, so let's go ahead and start masking off for the primer. You're always going to want to make sure you mask off further than where the scratches are, as far out as you can, so when you do prime and overlap these edges to cover them in primer, you're not meeting up with the tape or blowing the primer onto the masked off area. That'll create a hard line of primer, and that's going to be very difficult to get to sand out properly later. So make sure you give yourself enough room around the perimeter of the repair area where you're not going to be priming into the paper, just blending it out into the area. Paper should be a little bit beyond that. And I always do what's called back masking when I mask off for primer. I don't mask this way with a hard tape edge like that. Or if I do prime up to that, that would leave a very hard line. When you back tape it or back mask it, you're going to put the paper this direction, masking off the surrounding area, and then you're going to pull it backwards. And what this does is gives you this tape, when it rolls backwards on itself, it creates a softer edge, not so sharp, a little bit more of a blunt edge. So if you do kiss it now, it's not likely to create a hard edge there. All right, now we're going to go ahead and start priming this thing, but we want to make sure that we have enough ventilation in the area we're in. If we're outside, we should be okay. If we're inside a garage, we want to open the doors, get some ventilation, make sure that overspray or that those fumes are exiting the area and you're not just sitting in this cloud of fumes and you're not getting it all over the place. So we'll go ahead and get some ventilation going and we'll start applying the primer. So back to keeping things as sterile as possible each step of the way. I'm going to go ahead and wax and grease or de-wax and grease this area once again before I apply the primer. The environment we're spraying in today is about 70 degrees, so it's actually a perfect temp for applying a primer, a paint, or anything like that. But keep in mind, sometimes when a primer's been sitting for a while and the rattle can, it can kind of get cold. So when you spray, there's going to be less pressure in the can, and it's not going to atomize as well. It's going to be more like speckly than it is going to be a nice, smooth, satiny finish. So what you can do is, what I do is I either heat it up a little bit with a heat gun. You got to be careful when you do it that method, or put it in a bucket of hot water for 10-15 minutes. It'll create a little more pressure in the can, which will actually atomize the primer a lot better and, you know, lay down much nicer. And in between each coat, I like to use a heat gun. Use a heat gun to kind of make it cure a little faster, get it to lock up quicker so you can get your second coat and third and fourth coat on there quicker. Just sit and wait for the primer. You can do that, that's fine. But make sure you wait at least, 10 minutes at 70 degrees to make sure it's thoroughly flashed off and ready for the next coat. So as you can see, I actually did, unfortunately, end up kissing the edge of the paper right here with the primer. But I'm not that concerned. Over here, the primer is very thin on that blend edge. It shouldn't be a problem whatsoever. I guess it's like I tell my kid, do as I say, not as I do. So now I'm going to go ahead and dust a coat of guide coat over the primer here. And what that's going to do is, as you're wet sanding the primer, It's going to allow you to see any scratches or any inconsistencies in the primer that you may not have picked up on had you not used guide coat. What happens is you're going to be sanding the panel down flat like this, and any scratches or any little grooves or anything, the guide coat's going to set up in those valleys, and when you nib off the high spots, you'll still see the low spots because that guide coat got down into those areas. You want to sand it down until there's no more guide coat and the finish looks smooth, and then you're ready to move on to the painting process. Well, unfortunately, I ran out of time today, but I'll be back at it first thing tomorrow. We'll see you then in 1 second. Well, we're back at it this morning. So today we're going to go ahead and wet sand the primer there with some 1000 grit, get that all smoothed out and ready for base. We're going to be prepping the blend area over there to blend the clear coat in. Then we'll take all this masking off, we'll clean the panel, we'll de-wax and grease the area. Then we'll reapply some new masking tape, some fresh paper, and get it ready for the final paint. So we're going to be using what's called a hand sanding pad. This is a soft, flexible rubber pad that you put in the middle of the sandpaper like this. You fold the sandpaper around it. And why we use these hand pads is so that when you're wet sanding and you got your hand on the panel like this is going to spread the pressure of your hand out more evenly across the surface as compared to using your bare hand, which is going to have high spots where your knuckles are at. So when you're sanding with your hand, you're going to be actually putting grooves into the primer, creating waves, creating some unsightly waves that you just don't want. So when you're sanding, you're going to take that hand pad, wrap it up in the paper, and you're going to try to keep your hand as flat and even with that panel as you can. So you're distributing the pressure evenly across that whole panel. Because you really are only needing the paint to be around the area you feathered out and not really past that area. I'm going to sand this back down away from the edge, but before I get to that feather edge, so I can give myself more room to blend, just kiss the edge with the new paint instead of burying this whole edge in new paint and possibly having a big discrepancy in color. I'm not sure how this paint is going to match today. I've never used this type of paint, this brand, but I'm going to try to give us our best chance for a good result by just blending up to the edge instead of burying the edge in paint. Okay, you know what? That looks pretty good to me. I think we're ready to clean this panel up, de-wax and grease it, remask it with some fresh paper and tape, and get ready to blend that base coat out. So over in this area right here, there's some small chips right where I'm going to be blending the base, right in the blend area. I really don't want to leave them because when I paint it, it's going to allow the base coat to set up in these chips and you're going to still really see them and it's going to be an eyesore. This here is called a spot putty or a solvent-based putty. This is, again, is used for those very small things like small chips, small scratches, anything that's very superficial and not too deep, not too buried in the paint. Just want to put a little bit the putty on there and drag it down and into. You don't need too much. You put too much on, it takes forever to dry. You need just enough to get it in the blemish and a little bit on the surface, a little bit surrounding it. Now we're going to be using the 3M compound. This is a rubbing compound. What we're going to do is we're going to put it on a clean towel and we're going to buff the paint in the blend area. What that's going to do is removing any little imperfections, any kind of fallout, any contaminants, anything on the surface, bug guts, anything. We want that paint to be as clean as it was when it came from the factory, ensuring we're going to get the best possible adhesion when it comes to blending that. Now this bumper does have some chips and nicks in it. This is a 2012 vehicle, so it's acquired some chips and nicks in the bumper. Today I'm not going to be repainting the whole thing. For the purpose of this video, I'm showing you how to do a spot repair, how to do a blend. Ultimately, this bumper will need to be refinished, but today we're just going to go ahead and blend it in, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So now it's basically all ready for paint. All we have to do is do one more wipe down with those DeVilbiss wipes I was showing you earlier, tack it off with a tack rag, and start applying our base. I'm going to go ahead and move this out closer to the opening of the garage door to get better ventilation, and we're going to get this thing done. So now we're going to go ahead and tack this all off with a tack rag. A tack rag is like a sterile, almost like a cheesecloth with a stickiness to it. A little bit of tackiness, that's why it's a tack cloth. And we're going to wipe this whole surface down, edge to edge everywhere, and make sure any little lint or any kind of dust particles are on that panel are gone. The surface is ready for paint, and we'll start applying the base coat right now. So I'm going to show you, before I heat this can up, how it sprays, how it atomizes, the size of the droplets when they come out of the can, before I heat it and after I heat it. So what I got in here is some hot water. I'm going to set these cans in here for a little bit, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and allow those paints to heat up. By doing this, it's going to give us a finer atomization of the paint. This means the paint's going to lay out more evenly, and the pearl or metallic particles are going to lay down the way they should and not stand up and shift or change the color. Well, unfortunately, this can was just wrapped in a basic paper label that the water penetrated and ended up sloughing off. Anyways, it doesn't change the way this thing's going to spray. Let's go ahead and give it a shot. I've let it sit in the bucket now for about 15 minutes. Let's see the difference in atomization. When you heat up the spray can, what you're doing is building pressure inside that can, which is going to create a finer atomization of the paint particles. And at the same time, it's going to give you a more even fan pattern or spray pattern. So you're going to want to put on a light coat, light to medium coats when you're trying to cover the primer. You want about a 50% overlap of the fan, and you want to do multiple coats until it's completely covered. Make sure you let it flash off, dry up a little bit between coats, and continue until it's completely covered, and then we're going to blend it in. Now, reds are a notoriously translucent color, which means it's not going to cover quickly. It's going to take multiple coats of base to cover up the primered areas. But once we have the primered areas covered, that's what we're going to focus on first. Then we're going to come back over everything with a drop coat, which is the coat we're going to spray from a little further away to try to even out the color, even out the pearls or the metallics, and then blend, just kind of blending in this color from the primered area to the factory finish to make it a seamless repair. So it's looking like we're pretty well covered with the base coat. I can just see a very slight edge where the primer was. So I think I need one more coat, and then we're going to do what's called a drop coat. When you're applying base coat and applying it medium wet, you're laying it down kind of heavy. What can happen is you can create what's called tiger stripes or modeling of the paint, which is a bunch of, stripes or, just inconsistencies in the way the pearls and the metallic lays out. With a drop coat, you'll back up where you're spraying from, give yourself a little more distance. You're going to lightly be laying the paint on top of the paint you put down already. It's going to help with a more consistent and even laying out of the pearls and metallics, so everything looks really uniform. So we're slowly going to blend in the paint, so there's a nice transition from where we just painted and covered the primer to the factory color. So when you're blending paint, what you're doing is you're not going to go ahead and keep spraying like this and stop here, or just spraying like this and stop. You're going to take and with the nozzle, you're going to take and slowly transition the nozzle so it's facing sideways alongside the panel, not at the panel, but alongside the panel, so as to blend the little particles out onto the edge there. So the first coat we're going to apply is going to be a light medium coat, just a real light coat. It's not going to look great. It's not going to look like a nice shiny finished product. It's not meant for that. It's meant to give the second coat something to hold on to, hang on to, so it's not as likely to run on you. All right, it looks okay after the second coat, but clearly it's going to need one more wet coat, and I think that's going to do it, and it should look pretty dang good. Now that all looks pretty darn good. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna thin out, or we're gonna blend in the clear coat on the edge there with this spot blender. This is gonna help melt in the new paint into the factory paint. It should help us ensure a seamless repair. Make sure you're applying this while it's still kind of medium wet and not dry and not super wet. Super wet, you're gonna take a chance of running it too dry and it won't melt in properly. I'll tell you what, guys, I'm actually very impressed with this color match. This doesn't look bad at all. Clear laid out really nice. And I'm actually pretty happy and impressed with how well that color came out. And the clear as well. The clear laid out really well. There's a little peel to it, but we're going to address that in another episode. So over here, I'm going to put up a list of the materials I used and the costs for all of them, and how much it costs overall to perform this repair. A reputable body shop would charge you anywhere from $800 to $1,500. So this is really quite a remarkable savings if you're willing to tackle this type of repair on your own. After this repair has been made, I'm actually impressed with how well this base coat laid out and the clear coat laid out, and the color match itself. With this color here, it's not perfect. It's a little dark, the metallic's a little bit more heavy than I'd like to see, but I think 70 to 85% of the customers I performed this repair for would be happy with the results. So in the next episode, I'm going to show you how to take this repair to the next level. Most people would probably be just fine with the way this looks as is, but I'm going to show you how to do what's called color sanding and polishing. And once you color sand and polish, it's going to take this repair to a whole different level. It's going to look factory, it's going to look smooth. There won't be as much orange peel or any of that shrinking of the clear coat. It's going to look very seamless, especially once we polish out the blend on it and take care of all the details. It's going to look really great. I'm already quite pleased. So I hope you stay tuned to check that one out. And also stay tuned for future episodes where I'm going to go more in depth on different painting techniques and tricks and all the little things I've learned throughout the years, the skills I'd like to share with you if you're interested. So let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I'd be more than glad to answer them for you. Thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, you can give it a thumbs up and maybe consider subscribing. Anyhow, thanks again. We'll see you next time.